In Chapter 3, we explore the central concepts in economics that of supply and demand. And in addition to looking at supply and demand, we want to talk about equilibrium, or what we sometimes call market clearing, and understand how supply and demand interact with each other. The importance of all of this in this chapter is that this is how economists explain how prices are determined. If we want to understand why prices of goods and services are what they are, why they change, how they change, we have to understand this process of supply and demand and equilibrium. So in this chapter, we're going to look at the basics, and then in the next chapter, we're going to start to apply some of these ideas in some various ways. So to get at the basics, we got to first understand demand curves and supply curves. We'll do demand first, okay? What the demand curve is, and the definition in the Cowen and Tabarrok textbook, is a function that shows the quantity demanded at different prices, okay? And the phrase quantity demanded simply refers to the quantity of the good or service that buyers are willing and able to buy at a particular price. I think the best way to think about this is it's as if we went around to people and said, if the price of gasoline were $2 a gallon, how much would you buy? If it was $2.50 a gallon, how much would you buy? It was $3 a gallon, how much would you buy? And we sort of asked them that question, right, and try to figure out at different prices how much gas would they buy in a week or a month or a year, whatever our unit of time might be. And the important thing about that is that we're holding everything else constant. All we're saying to people is that the price of the good in question is changing. How many Big Macs would you buy if the price were this? How many 6 packs of Coke would you buy if the price? So we're just varying the price. Everything else, anything else that might matter, people's income, a change in their preferences, a change in the price of other goods, all that stuff we're locking away in a box somewhere and saying we're not interested in that. We're holding that constant. We're keeping it away. Right? All we want to know when we construct a demand curve is if we change the price, how much, what will be the quantity that you will demand. And one of the things we learn very quickly is that demand curves slope downward. That is, there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So for example, again, take my gasoline example, I do it automatically, of course, right? That as the price of gasoline goes up, people will buy less gas, right? As the price of Big Macs goes up, people will buy fewer Big Macs, right? That's the basic idea of the law of demand. We don't know for sure how many fewer they will buy, right? That's a separate question, but we know they'll buy fewer, right? And when the price of a good goes up, people will look for substitutes for that good and try to find something else that they can use instead. So take a more simple example. When the price of, say, chicken goes up, right? People will say, well, it's more expensive to buy chicken. Maybe I'll buy beef or pork or have a salad instead, right, and look for a substitute. And that's what pulls us away from the good as the price goes up. And notice, by the way, that's going to affect the demand and price for that other good. But the key thing is that demand curves slope downward. And you can see from the PowerPoint and the textbook how that works. And again, as we graph supply and demand, we graph it by putting the price of the good on the vertical axis and the quantity demanded or supplied on the horizontal axis. And again, you can see those graphs in the textbook and in the PowerPoint. And there's two ways, as the book points out, to read a demand curve. You can read it horizontally and say, at a given price, how much are people willing to buy? But you can look at it vertically and say, what are people willing to pay for a given quantity? So if people want to buy, say, 5 pounds of ground beef in a week, right? What are they willing to pay to get that 5 pounds? So either way, you can look at demand curves and, again, supply curves either way. I think it's easier. I like the horizontal way of looking at it better, which is at a given price, how much are people willing to buy? But either way is fine. So you might want to work your way through the self-check problems in the PowerPoint and make sure that you understand that, okay? And again, demand curves are negatively sloped. That's what we call the law of demand, right? That as the price of a good goes up, the quantity demanded goes down, and if the price of a good goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. What's interesting to think about is why it's downward sloping. That is, sort of, why does it work that way? Well, one way to think about it is that at a higher price, okay, people are less willing to use that. The uses to which people will put that good have to be more and more important. So if the price of gasoline is really high, right, you're not going to take your car out for a spin in the country just to have fun. You're going to save. You're going to ration yourself. You're going to make sure that you only spend money on gasoline for things that are really important, like going to work, or going to the grocery store, or going to the doctor, things like that, right? Sort of the more, when prices go up, we focus on the more important uses of the good. Now, when the price goes down, we sort of think to ourselves, well, now the price goes down, we can bring in those other uses that aren't as important, right, as before. So, for example, right, if water is expensive, you won't bathe your dog that often, right? You won't wash your car in your driveway that often because you'd rather have that water for yourself to either drink or bathe yourself. But as water gets cheaper, you're going to say, okay, well, now I can afford, it's worth it. The value to me of having my dog clean more often or my car clean more often is such that it's worth it to me to do that more often now that the price of the good is lower, so the price of water is lower. So this is a key idea, right? That the one way of thinking about the reason why demand curves slope down is as the price falls, more of the marginal uses, right? More of the additional uses of that good are now worth it, right? You won't, the value to you of the clean dog isn't high enough to justify paying the high price for water, but it might be enough to justify you paying the lower price for water. So that's the basics of demand curve. Is one of the concepts we want to make sure we talk about when we talk about demand curves, and that's the idea of consumer surplus. And consumer surplus, put most simply, is the difference between the maximum price a consumer is willing to pay for a good and the actual market price. Okay, so for example, if the maximum you're willing to pay for 3 Big Macs is $15, okay, and in fact Big Macs cost $2 each, so you have to only pay $6 spend $6 on 3, $15 that you would be willing to pay minus the $6 you do pay, you earn a consumer surplus of $9. I think one way to think about consumer surplus, it's like a psychological profit we earn, right? Because the price we pay in the market is almost always going to be less than the maximum price we'd be willing to pay for a good. And that'll vary from place to place and time to time, okay? But for most people, right, they'd be willing to pay a lot more, but the fact that there is this interaction of all these suppliers and all these demanders means that there's one market price usually, or a small number of market prices, and that there's a difference between what we'd be willing to pay for a unit or 2 units or 3 units of that good and what we actually have to pay. And that difference, again, is consumer surplus. One way to look at that is as the book points out, it is the area under the demand curve but above the equilibrium price, the market clearing price. And again, you should take a look at the book and the PowerPoint to see that most closely. Okay, so that's consumer surplus. The other thing we want to talk about is why demand curves shift. Okay, and if you look at the book, there's a list there of various factors that can shift the demand curve. A couple things, I'm not going to go through all those in detail, but I want to say 2 or 3 things. One is an increase in demand. That is, if demand increases, the curve shifts to the right. It is not a good idea to talk about the curve shifting up or down or in or out. That's ambiguous. The best way to think about it with demand curves is they shift right when demand goes up. They shift to the left when demand goes down. Describing the curve as shifting up or down or in and out, it just doesn't help. Stay with left or right when we're talking about demand curves shifting. Why did demand curve shift? Well, remember the box we had before. We put everything in that box and said we're not going to allow that to change. Demand curves shift when we let stuff out of that box, when we allow, for example, people's preferences or their income to change, when we allow the prices of other goods to change. There's other kinds of things we'll see in a minute that can happen, that can change, that can cause that demand curve to change. Shifting the demand curve is shifting the entire relationship between price and quantity demanded. It's not just asking how much would you buy at a different price. It's giving us a whole new set of relationships, right? A whole new function, if you want to think more mathematically. So an increase in demand, for example, at each price, people are willing to buy more, and at each quantity, people are willing to pay a higher price, and conversely with a decrease in demand. There are 6 factors that can shift demand. I'm not going to go through them in detail. They're covered, I think, pretty well in the book. We've mentioned some of them already. One is a change in income. For most goods, if your income goes up, you buy more of it. Not everything. Think about ramen noodles, for example. An increase in population will increase demand. An increase in the price of substitute goods will increase the demand for a particular good. So, for example, if the price of chicken goes up, the demand for beef will go up. So as chicken gets more expensive, people substitute away from chicken into beef. So as the price of a substitute goes up, demand goes up. Price of a complement works the opposite way. Think razors and razor blades. If the price of razor blades goes up, people are going to buy fewer razor blades and therefore buy fewer razors. So the demand, if the price of razor blades goes up, the demand curve for razors shifts to the left. That is, the demand goes down. Expectations can shift demand curves. If our expectations of future prices change, that can do it. And taste and preferences, right? People simply, perhaps we learn that apples cure a particular disease, right? All of a sudden, everybody's buying apples. So those are the things that can shift demand. And again, you can see the book and the PowerPoint cover those in much more detail. So let's talk a little bit about supply. The story for supply is more or less the same thing, but looking at the other side of the market, right? When we think about what a supply curve is, it is a function that shows the quantity of goods supplied at different prices. So, for example, we can do the same sort of thing. We can say, if the price of Big Macs were $3, how many Big Macs would you supply? If the price was $4, how many would you supply? Price 5, how many would you supply? Same thing, we're locking everything else in the box, okay? An interesting question to think about is, what are we locking up in the box with supply that's going to be different than demand? We'll come back and talk about that in a minute. But the supply curve is constructed by holding everything else constant and simply varying the price of the good, okay? The tricky part with supply is understanding why that supply curve slopes upward. And it's about opportunity cost, okay? So one example in the book is as the price of oil rises, it becomes more profitable to extract oil from more costly sources, right? So therefore, as the price goes up, the quantity supply increases. And that's a perfectly good way to think about it, right? That as it's worth it to drill deeper or use more complicated technology to drill for oil if the price is high. If the price is low, it's not worth it, okay? The example I would give is sort of imagine you have a farmer who's got farmland that can be used to grow either soybeans or wheat, okay? As the price of wheat goes up, we'll move land from growing soybeans to wheat. Wheat's more valuable. We'll grow fewer soybeans, we'll take some of that land and we'll move it to wheat. And we'll do that even if that land requires more work to grow that wheat, right? If you think about it, the unit of land that we give up from growing soybeans is probably going to be one that is not necessarily great for growing wheat, right? And so we're going to have to actually work it to make it happen. But the higher price of wheat means that the opportunity cost of growing soybeans has risen, right? So if you think about the farmer saying soybeans or wheat, price of wheat goes up. If I grow soybeans, what am I giving up? I'm giving up more income because the price of wheat is higher than it used to be. And so as that opportunity cost rises, I'm going to shift out of soybeans and into wheat. So that's one way to think about it. If you want to think about another kind of example here, as the demand, let's say, for strip malls and for restaurants and so on increases, okay, using land in the countryside or in the exurb suburbs to grow, say, cherry trees, the opportunity cost of that grows, right? Because the land's more valuable to have strip mall, restaurant, a Walmart, whatever it might be, right? And so the owners of that land find themselves thinking, well, I'm growing fruit or whatever, not worth it if they'll pay me that much more and the lands become more valuable in other uses. So the opportunity cost of whatever it is you're doing now is rising, okay? And as the price of that goes up, you'll be more likely to switch. So supply curves slope up, all right? We supply more of a good when the price of that good rises because the opportunity cost of using the inputs and the resources to make other goods rises, right? So if again, if we can think about the soybeans and wheat example, right? If the price of wheat goes up, the opportunity cost of using that same land that can grow either wheat or soybeans, the opportunity cost of growing soybeans increases, and so we'll grow less soybeans, fewer soybeans, and more wheat. Okay. Again, if that is challenging, take a look at the book, and certainly take a look at the PowerPoint as well. So again, we can talk the same way. We can talk about producer surplus with respect to supply. And again, just like before, that is the difference now with supply, right? It is the difference between the price that the producer receives for his or her good and the minimum price at which the person would be willing to have supplied the good or sell a particular quantity of the good, right? So if we say, what would it take to get you to sell three Big Macs, and you say, well, I would sell them for $1 a piece, but in fact in the market they're selling for $2 a piece, then you're earning a consumer surplus of $1, producer surplus of $1 per Big Mac for a total of 3. So your producer surplus there would be 3. If this were a microeconomics course, we'd go on to talk about how that is a way of thinking about profit. And it essentially is, right? The price you're getting minus that minimum you take, that supply curve reflects, in some sense, the cost of production. Again, it's not something we need to get into, but it's okay to think about producer surplus as being something like monetary profit. Supply curves shift just like demand curves do, okay? An increase in supply shifts the supply curve to the right. A decrease in supply shifts the supply curve to the left. Why does supply curve shift? Because we let all the stuff out of the box. All that stuff we've been holding constant in that locked box. We allow that out. We allow that to change. That changes the whole relationship between price and quantity supplied. Okay. And the 5 factors that can shift supply curves, again, I'm going to list them. You should look in the book to get them more carefully and more closely. Technological innovations and changes in the price of inputs. So, for example, if it gets cheaper to produce a good, the supply curve will shift to the right. Supply will increase, right? If technology makes that more cheap to do, that's what will happen. Taxes and subsidies. If taxes raise the cost of producing the good, taxes shift supply curves to the left. They reduce supply. Subsidies increase supply. Expectations. Same thing here again. If you expect the price of a good to be greater in the future, you will hold back today and supply more in the future. Entry or exit of producers. This is sort of like population on the demand side, right? If more firms come in, supply increases, it shifts to the right. If firms leave the industry, supply decreases, it shifts to the left. And finally, changes in opportunity cost, the example we did with the soybean and wheat. So those are the factors that can shift the supply curve. So again, one of the things to think about here is that demand and supply work sort of are mirror images of each other. There's some differences, right? The things we lock up in the box are different. But again, in drawing the curves, what we do is we lock that stuff away. We hold everything constant. We just vary price and say at different prices, what quantity would you be willing to supply? What quantity would you be willing to demand? In the next chapter, we'll put these together and talk about market equilibrium. We'll talk about how we understand movements in price and so on. I think the key as you study the supply curve and demand curve sort of in isolation this way really is understanding those factors that can shift the curve. Understanding why the demand curve slope down and supply curve slope up is important too. And by the way, one easy way to remember that, demand curves slope down, D for demand, D for down. Supply curves slope up, S for supply, S for the sky. That's where they point to. So if you have trouble remembering that, that's a nice little way of doing so. But in the next chapter, we'll start moving those curves around and how they interact with each other and really begin to understand them. Here, it's about understanding the factors that can shift the curve and the direction in which the curve will shift as those factors change. So make sure you pay close attention to that in the text and in the PowerPoint, and then also in the homework questions as well. We'll look at how that all plays out in understanding price in the next chapter.